Okay. All right. So where is our screen? Here we are. Okay. Shahashoel chayiv ba'onsin. We had said that a borrower is liable for all onsin, for all mishaps, except for what? What did we say? What was the one exception that a shoel is pater for? If it's mesa machmas malacha, if the animal in the normal course of wear and tear, or the object being borrowed in the normal course of wear and tear breaks down. Okay, now the imshal shofar litkabot kias mitzvah yesh ladum de'enu chayiv ba'onsin dehanas mitzvah lo havi hana ba'ain mashe kasafti lekaman siftala divrei maskal hashol sefer. We're going to discuss borrowing an object of a mitzvah. If you borrow an object of a mitzvah, such as a shofar, and it gets damaged in the course of just a mishap, a total mishap. So there are poskim who would argue that perhaps you're not going to be liable because the definition of a shoel, of a borrower, is someone who's deriving benefit without compensating for it. When I'm borrowing a shofar, I'm not deriving benefit from the shofar because we have a principle of mitzvot lav lehanot nitnu, that the mitzvahs were not given to us for personal benefit. So we don't call that personal benefit. You're borrowing a shofar. That's at least the argument to be made for why you would not be obligated in ones if you borrow an item of a mitzvah. So we'll look at that a little bit later on, because there's an opposing argument to be made, which is I am benefiting in the sense that I don't have to pay someone to rent their shofar, so I'm saving money, perhaps. But let's see. Taka b'shofar chaveru b'rshus v'nistak pater dahavi le'mesa machmas malacha. According to everybody, if you blow your friend's shofar, and in the course of blowing it, it cracks, so then you'll be pater, because that's called, even though you're a shoel, that's called mesa machmas malacha, in the normal course of wear and tear. Shoal tefillin mechaveru v'nemtzu. You borrow tefillin from your friend, and a mishap occurs, and the tefillin end up getting damaged. Hol ve'ein derech litein mos b'sheilas and havi keshofar deyesh omrim depater mishum demitzvos lav lehanos nidman. Because people don't normally pay for the usage of tefillin, it would be the same thing as borrowing a shofar. And since you're not getting personal benefit from wearing the tefillin, because mitzvahs are not for personal benefit, you would, again, not be considered a real shoel, and therefore you would not be liable for ones. And the same deliberation is made over a talis and your lulav, the lulav in esrog, which happens all the time. You lend someone your esrog and he breaks the pitum. Okay. He says when you borrow very expensive, very valuable tefillin, and then they get stolen, so then you are going to be liable. He says because even if you're not a shoel, you still at least have the status of a shomer sachar. Okay, so therefore, mechuyev l'shalim avuram kefi shavyusam ve'enu yachol litein tmurasam tefillim ksherim pshutim. You have to replace the tefillin at the same value of the ones that were stolen. You can't say, I'm just going to give you a kosher pair of tefillin, because you got to pay dollar for dollar. Yeah, but there's different grades. There's for sure different levels. Yeah.
Rabbi, I'm unclear as to why we said only if they're expensive would that apply. Wouldn't it apply? You have to replace dollar for dollar regardless of how expensive they are?
Yes. Yeah. What he means to say is, don't think that you can get away if the tefillin were expensive, that you can get away with a cheaper pair of tefillin.
Okay.
Okay.
around in the shul. Now, let's say you throw on that tefillin and it falls accidentally and sort of cracks a bit or something like that. So what happened in a situation like that? So you were okay. Yeah, you were content to use that tefillin.
Yeah, but I don't think that that's called an onus. That's either negligence or it's aveda or loss. It's not an onus. It's not a total mishap. If a total mishap means that it was out of your control to avert, but if a pair of tefillin falls off your head, then obviously it wasn't placed on properly, right? So everyone has to assume that risk. That if I borrow someone's tefillin, I have permission to do so, but I have to pay if I damage it, right? Okay. Ruve nosan mos l'shliach laholicho l'levi, v'nosan lo rishus lihishtamesh imoim b'derech. Okay, another scenario. Ruvain gives cash to a shaliach. He gives cash to Shimon, his shaliach. And he says, bring this cash to Levi. And I hereby give you permission that if you need cash on the journey, you can use some of my cash, just replace it. And that's precisely what Shimon does. And then something happens to the rest of the money. He gets held up at gunpoint and he has to relinquish all of the money. So he says, Ayin b'divrei gaonim klal tzadivav ostes. He says, I refer you to what the gaonim say over there. He doesn't tell us what the halacha is. We'd have to go and take a look. Ayin b'divrei gaonim. I'm not sure which sefer he's referring to. There must be a sefer called Divrei Gaonim. I'll try and look it up for you.
So I guess the issue there is he's partially borrowing and partially transporting the funds.
Right. So he's acting in one sense. Right. Exactly. In one sense, he's acting as a shomer chinam, or perhaps even a shomer sachar. He may be a shomer sachar because he gets the benefit of using the money. But an onus occurred on the part where he was not borrowing. That's, I guess that's the analytics there, Paul. Okay. So let us continue. Okay, let's take a look now at the next piece in the Imrei Yaakov. Chayev ba'onsin. He says if you are a borrower, you're liable for all onus. Okay. Klala de shoel detzar shia kol hana'a shalo. He says the general principle of a shoel, the reason why he's chayev in all onsin is because all benefit is purely his. The owner is not benefiting at all, and so therefore the borrower assumes full liability. He says, but what if through my borrowing your object, you benefit as well? You, the owner, benefit from my borrowing the object, so then I'm not a shoel anymore. I'm considered to be a socher, where I'm compensating you in some way for the use of your item. So, for example, there are times when I might have a work animal and I don't have enough work for the animal to do. And in order for the animal to remain healthy, he needs to continue working. Because if he remains too dormant, the animal may be compromised. So then there's a symbiotic relationship. And therefore, I'm not a shoel anymore, even though you're letting me use your animal for free. Venira da afilu nasan hashol leba'olim pachos mishava pruta sulo havi ala din shoel kevin degam haba'olim nehenin. And that's true, even if the shoel gives even less than a shava pruta, which is a minimal amount of money, he's no longer a shoel. The afal gav de shomer sachar lo havi bischar shu pachas mishava pruta. Mikol makom legabe mashal sagi la bepachas mishava pruta kevin delo havi kol hana shalo. He says, and even though normally if a person who is renting something gives less than a pruta's worth in order to rent it, that does not make him into a shomer sachar. Nonetheless, even the most minimal amount reduces your level of liability to no longer be a shoel. He says, when we say that a shoel is liable for all onsen, this is true, even if you're lending something to him is considered an act of charity because he's a poor man. Even though in the course of lending something to him, you're still doing the mitzvah of tzedakah, but nonetheless, you're still considered to be a lender, and he's considered to be a borrower. Let me just see where this piece ends. Oh, okay, yeah, okay. So that's the end of the Imrei Yaakov on this sif. Let's take a look at the biurim for just a second. He says, Imrei Yaakov huva hadin shemesa machmas malacha pater. He says, we've established that if the object dies in the normal course of wear and tear, you're going to be pater. The imshal mitriya mechavero, the hishtamish ima bizman shahaya ruach she'ena mitzuya. What happens if you borrow an umbrella? This is a very common scenario. You borrow an umbrella and you use it in a very gusty storm. A storm which has an unusual wind. I just listened on the radio yesterday. There was a guy who had a Chevy Silverado in Texas, and he had just had a job interview. And as he's driving back from the interview, he gets caught in a tornado. The tornado blows his car on its side and then blows it over back on the ground. And everything was on tape. And he was able to drive away. So Chevy got such good press from this that the pickup truck was damaged, so they gave him a new pickup truck, and the dealership gave him an extra $15,000 just to compensate him because they got an amazing video clip of a Chevy Silverado surviving a tornado. And
it sounds like one of those commercials where underneath it says, "This is just a demonstration. Don't try this at home," or something like that.
That's right. That's right. And he got the job, so it was like a big success story. Yeah. Anyway, so you borrow your friend's umbrella and you get caught in a hurricane. If the umbrella breaks because of this unusual wind, it would seem that you have to compensate your friend for the loss of his umbrella. You can't say, well, it was the normal course of usage, regular wear and tear. He says, he says, what's the whole reason why you're exempt if in the normal course of using it breaks? He says the reason is because you didn't use the object in a way that is different from the way that the owner would have used it in the course of his workday. And therefore the owner lost out because because they should not have lent out the animal for work that the animal itself could not endure. In other words, the animal, we look at it as the animal was the one which had a weakness to it, and therefore you can't blame the borrower for doing the normal type of work that you would normally do with that kind of animal. He quotes where this is found. So therefore, You borrow an umbrella and you use it in a regular rainstorm and it breaks. So then we could understand why the shoal should be exempt. O shaba pitom ruach chazaka she'ena mitzuya v'shibra miyad mitriya. Or all of a sudden it was a regular rainstorm, and out of nowhere, while the umbrella is already open, this huge gust of wind comes and it breaks the umbrella completely unannounced. Az shaykh lepotra mitam mesamach mas malacha. Then you could exempt the shoel because it's in the normal course of wear and tear. In other words, the shoel is not using it in any way differently from if the owner was using it at that moment. But in this case, a strong wind was already gusting, and this wind is known to break umbrellas. And this guy said, I'm using this umbrella anyway because I don't want to get wet. You can't make the same argument that the owner lost out. It was the owner's loss. Because there the argument would be, I didn't lend it to you to use in this kind of gusty wind. Everyone knows you don't use an umbrella in a hurricane. And that's why the shoel has to pay. Okay? All right. So I think the point is very clear, right? If you use the object in a way that is hazardous to the life of the object that is being borrowed, and the owner if the owner had known that you were going to be using his object in that way, he would not have lent it to you. And he wouldn't use the object in that way, right? So you say, can I borrow your car? And he doesn't realize that you're borrowing his car because you're going to be driving in a stock car race. And you're going to be driving the car at insane speeds and competing with other drivers. And, if anything happens to the car in that situation, that's not called mesamach mas malacha. I don't know what happened. The car just broke down. Well, why did it break down? Well, maybe because you were skidding all over the parking lot or whatever it was. You went on a drag racing. Okay, let's take a look at the Likutim. And he says, Shahashomer chinam v'chulei, a shomer chinam is only liable for negligence. Im nignav dover mi beis hakneses poter hashamish delo havishomer sachar. He says, if an item is stolen from the shul, is the shul liable? Is the shamus liable? So the answer is no, because no one's paying us to watch your stuff, right? So you leave your stuff here in shul, and it gets stolen. No, you can't hold the synagogue liable. He says the guy, there's a shamus in the shul who's in charge of caretaking, but he's not in charge of watching your stuff. So you can't say, I pay my membership. I expect, right? What do you expect? Take your membership and anyway. But anyway, the point is that you can't say that I'm paying for the use of the shul, and therefore the shul is a shomer sachar. Shul's not a shomer sachar. That's not what you're paying membership for. Okay.
Rabbi, it seems like even in a situation where you pay, that they often will contract out. Like if you go to somewhere and you check your code and you pay $5 to check your code, there's usually a sign there that says not responsible for loss. So even though you've paid for them to watch it, they kind of contract out of that by putting a sign saying we're not responsible.
Right. And the $5 that you're paying is not for them to protect your coat from theft. The $5 is for the service of not having to look around to hang up your coat in the coat room and take the extra few minutes, right? At least that would be the argument that they would make. We're not here to, this is not Brinks, this is not the vault. We're not putting your coat in the vault to protect it from theft.
Right.
What's that? They're right. Exactly. Okay. Yes, sometimes. I'm not so sure, though. Is that really the expectation of the consumer when you check your code in? So the fact that Lloyd is arguing the fact that they put up the sign means that they know that some people are expecting their coats to be protected from theft. All right, interesting. It's one of those gray areas. Okay. Gizbarei hakahal, hamemunim sheyesh tachas yadamo shel hakahal. Okay, so you have people who are in charge of community funds. Okay, so I guess they've collected funds from the community in order to build something, in order to build a new mikvah or whatever it is. Dinam kishomer sachar ein Choshen Mishpat siman ein beis hey. What is their status? Do they have a status of a shomer sachar or a shomer chinam? That's discussed in the Shulchan Aruch. V'im sachar b'pachos mishava pruta ihaver shomer sachar das hashachta lo havi v'yesh cholkim. We saw this discussion already that if you pay less than a shava pruta, do you become a shomer sachar or are you a shomer chinam? It's a machlokes. Mishu hu sachir eitzel balabayis l'shana l'chol sheirut asher yitzdarech. A person is hired for a year to act as a butler for any service, domestic service that he needs. The balabas sends him on a chore to transport cash. And while the guy is on the road, he loses the money. Dino kishomer sachar, af she'enu mekabel schar b'miyuchad avor shlichuzeh. In that case, since he's being compensated, his job is to do whatever job the guy asks him to do. So he can't say, sorry, boss, I lost it, and I'm not liable. No, you are liable. I'm paying you. So since I'm paying you, you're a shomer sachar, and your liability is you're responsible for loss and theft. If you were a shomer chinam, if you were doing this for me for free, then you could make such a claim. But that's not the case over here. So it is interesting if you have an employee, someone's under your employ, and you send them on a trip to go take an envelope of cash and bring it to the bank and make a deposit. And they run in and get a coffee on the way in, and someone jimmies their door open and takes the pouch of cash from the front seat. So technically the employee is liable because they're being paid for their delivery. And right, so that's an interesting idea. So sometimes you have to swallow it just for practical reasons.
That even seems negligent to leave it on the seat.
Yeah, well, it could be negligence, or maybe yes, maybe no. That's a possibility, Paul. And Moshe is saying, what about damage? What about damaged goods? Where an employee goes ahead and damages goods. So you'd have to ascertain, was it negligence? Was it on the level of just standard loss, or was it an onus? If he was being reckless in the way that he was transporting the item and he breaks it. I mean, we just had a case. My wife has this cleaning lady, comes in once or twice a week. And we had just bought a coffee maker, cheap coffee maker, nothing expensive. And the first time she's washing it, she goes ahead and breaks the carafe, which is such happens all the time. But whenever I clean the carafe, I mean, I had the same carafe for years and it never broke. So clearly there was a certain level of maybe she was in a rush, not a bad person, but she just wasn't being that careful. So my wife said, no problem. Would you stay an extra 2 hours to work off the carafe? And she said yes. And she worked it off. So, but I think in that kind of situation, it was a $40 coffee maker. So it was, yeah, 20 bucks an hour.
What?
Yeah. Yeah.
20 years at this point.
Right.
That's really based on my hustle, really, because it can happen. You're moving so many sticks in a day, and it can happen.
Well, I guess it depends on how often it happens.
It's not often.
Yeah.
It's not often. It's a lot.
Maybe the craft had a fracture.
Well,
Maybe it was the craft that was faulty.
the carafe was faulty. It's possible, although every time I used it, it was perfectly fine. There was no crack in the carafe. Okay.
Employees make mistakes that are costing the company money, and different levels of how these mistakes are happening, so like you have an employee that's been with you for a while, you just don't look the other way.
Right. There's and then of course, you have this thing called shrinkage, right? That's stealing. So that's, some people even look the other way when they know their employees are stealing, because they say that's the cost of doing business and that's their bonus for the year.
That was thrown out the back door. But it's,
But you got rid of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they became too
we gotta be
greedy.
very careful maybe somebody it was actually 45 years. I would have been on the hook for 2 years of compensation. So I taught the methodology of how to deal with that in a very, very careful way with it worked well. It's not an easy thing when you have somebody with you that many years.
Not today. Not today.
The courts very low favor of the employee.
Absolutely.
Wow. Okay, we'll hold it here for today. Have a good day.